العالمين نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وآله وأصحابه وسلم. Now it was in the year 1095 when the Christian Catholic Pope in France, Urban II, proclaimed and announced what later in time became known as a crusade, an expedition. Those who listened to him and those who responded to his call were a complex measure of all kinds of people. Some of them were the barons and the nobles and the knights. Others were brigands. Some were thieves and robbers. Some were murderers themselves. And he appealed to a cross-section of society because he hoped that people from all kinds of society would listen to his appeal and would respond to it. There were many reasons why, in fact, he called for what later came to be known as a crusade. A crusade, a pilgrimage, an armed pilgrimage from Western Europe down to the Muslim world, Jerusalem, to reclaim, at least they believed, to reclaim this holy precinct, this sacred city of Jerusalem for the Christians. One of the reasons was because the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus had written a letter to Pope Urban II asking for assistance, because there was a fear of a threat of Seljuk attack into Constantinople, and he wanted it to be thwarted, and he needed reinforcements from the Catholics. Another reason was because there were reports of abuse and tyranny from the Christian pilgrims who were returning from Jerusalem back to Europe. And they were complaining that the Muslims are mistreating them. And they were complaining that the Holy Sepulchre, what they believed to be the most sacred site on earth, where they believed, and they falsely and incorrectly believed, that Isa alayhi salam was buried. And we believe, of course, that Allah raised him. وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ لَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. He was not killed, nor was he crucified, but it was made to appear like them, thereof. But in any case, they believed that was the most sacred precinct on earth, site on earth. And they believed that it was not looking the way it used to look, and that was partly correct. Because in the early 11th century, the Fatimid Shia Khalif, Al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah, had desecrated a part of it. And that infuriated the Christians. And so they would go back with these reports to Western Europe. And therefore the Christians believed they have every right on earth to go and reclaim Jerusalem for themselves. Another reason was this, that they began this process of propaganda against Islam and the Muslimin. Now, of course, you know that we had many Christians living in the Middle East, in the Muslim world. They were Ahlul Dhimmah. We treated them just like ourselves, the native Christians, and we gave them their rights, and they paid the jizya, and they lived as equal citizens. But there were no Muslims living in Europe in the 12th century. Therefore, they had no knowledge of Islam. The Qur'an was not available, translated for them. They knew next to nothing about Islam, and so they began to concoct these fabricated stories. Like in Jerusalem, in the Middle East, Muslims worship a man called Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Muslims pray to an idol called Muhammad. Muslims do all these evil practices. And therefore, in the minds of those people, it made them believe they're actually fighting a holy war, a holy expedition. And so, the fourth reason was that in Christianity, there was no real historical precedent that they could use. How do you convince a Christian population to take up arms and go and defend a city somewhere else and potentially kill those people to reclaim that city for yourselves? Where is the Christian precedent for that? Of course, one might look to the Old Testament and the destruction of nations, and in fact many Christians began to do that. They began to look at what does the Old Testament say about that, about the Maccabees and about the Moabites, and about the destruction of nations, and the belief in divine vengeance, that God willed it to happen like that. And that in fact became one of the calls, in fact the most important call of the crusade. Dus wollt, that God wills it to happen. God wills it to happen. And so combined therefore with this belief that Jerusalem belongs to them, because within Jerusalem is the Holy Sepulchre. They call it the Mother Church. And that is a site that belongs to Christendom, and they believe they should have a right to it. Secondly, the belief that the Holy Sepulchre was being mistreated by Muslims, and the pilgrims would go and tell this information back to those in Europe. And thirdly, a complete ignorance of Islam, no knowledge of what the Muslims are, who they are, what they believe in. And number four, this idea of redemption of sin, atonement. So Pope Urban II is appealing to a people who were brigands, they were thieves, they were robbers. And he was able to project this expedition as what? As an holy expedition. If they traveled and they fought and they were killed in that expedition, they would be martyrs. And if they're martyrs, redemption of sin, all their sins are forgiven. Now you got to think, how would that have appealed to those who were sinful? To those who had blood on their hands, to those who were fighting one another. And of course for them it was like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. That I got to go and I got to cleanse these sins from myself. And they went with these different motives. There are about 4 or 5 different versions of the speech of Urban II. One of them from Robert of Reims, he says, we must give the greatest honor to the church of that holy city from which we have received the grace of redemption and the source of all Christianity. Another one, Guibert of Nogent, the French monk, he said that, this Jerusalem is in the hand of an unclean race, meaning the Muslims, a people who have no right to it. And within that precinct, that sacred precinct, they indulge in all kinds of blasphemous actions. And so they marched and they went down from Jerusalem. They had the pilgrim purse in one hand and the pilgrim staff in the other hand. And they had the sword and their lances. And they went therefore as pilgrims. That is the way that Urban II preached this expedition, as a holy war, as an armed pilgrimage. Those who left were called Peregrini Milite Christi. They were pilgrim knights of Christ. And they went down to fight the Muslims in Jerusalem. Along the way, in 1097, they captured the capital of the Seljuk state, the city of Iznik. In 1098, they captured the states of Edessa and Antioch. Down the way, they captured Marat al-Numan and indulged in many heinous and evil actions. And in 1099, they arrived in Jerusalem. And they laid siege to Jerusalem, and they captured Jerusalem. According to Ibn al-Athir, rahimahullah, they killed approximately 70,000 Muslims and some Jews at the same time. It was a complete bloodbath. And the way that Christian chroniclers early on would depict this expedition and this massacre and this killing was as an act of divine vengeance. That they deserved it because God was pleased with it. And remember, of course, for the Catholics, they believe that the Pope is infallible in matters of dogma. So for him to be preaching an expedition, although he's not infallible, they don't believe he's infallible in that, of course, but he has this, they had to believe that he was a representative of Christ on earth. So whatever he's saying must be correct. And the evil that they were committing, and the killing of children, and the killing of women, it was, just God wills it. Now you can imagine, of course, how that must have affected the Muslim world. That was the first time in Islamic history that the Franks, not the Byzantines, they were not simply Byzantine hordes who were coming from Byzantium and are coming to raid and loot in the Muslim world. These guys were Christians. And they had the signs of Christianity on them. They carried the Bible with them. There were monks with them. There were priests amongst them. And so they were different, and it confused the Muslims. Like, who are these people? And they had real Christian zeal and vigor with them. So it confused the Muslims. If they came a few years earlier, like in 1092 for example, they would have been met by Nizam al-Mulk rahimahullah, and Malik Shah rahimahullah, the beacons of the Seljuk state who both died within months of one another in 1092. They arrived at a time of political disunity. They came in a time where the Muslim empire was fragmented because you had these small sultans and dynasties, and each one was only concerned about his own power, his own kursi, his own seat. And the Caliph in Baghdad was Nama Khalif, he was asleep. He wasn't interested except what was concerning him immediately. And so they came in a time where the Muslim world was like this. And you had the division between the Sunni and the Shia, and so many divisions. And that they used it to their advantage. What also was to the advantage of the Crusaders was the fact that the demographics of Syria was to their favor. Because as they were marching down to Jerusalem, you had the Syriacs and the Armenians to the north of Syria, the native Christian small groups. You had the Maronites of Lebanon. And all of these small Christian groups chose to ally themselves with the Crusaders. And they provided them with intelligence. And many of them, in fact, joined ranks with them and went down and fought with them against the Muslims. And so they came, and it was a shock for the Muslims, and it was a bloodbath. Well, what was the response then for the Muslim Ummah? There was no real political response from the Caliph. From the sultans, there was nothing, next to nothing. There was a few expeditions here and there, but nothing concrete. In fact, some of the first responses came from the ulama and the poets. In the year 1099, the Qadi of Damascus, al-Harawi, he traveled from Damascus to Baghdad, where the Caliph was. And he entered the masjid on the day of Friday, and he broke the minbar. He broke the minbar out of protest. Like the Muslims in Sham, in Syria, are being slaughtered. And you're doing nothing. And he broke the minbar and he recited the poem of Abu Muzaffar al-Wardi. وَكَيْفَ تَنَامُ الْعَيْنِ مِلْأَ جُفُونُهَا عَلَى هَفَوَاتٍ أَيْقَظَتْ كُلَّ نَائِمٍ وَإِخْوَانُكُمْ بِالشَّامِ يُضْحِي مَقِيلُهُمْ ظُهُورَ الْمَذَاكِ أَوْ بُطُونَ الْقَشَائِمِ وَكَادَ لَهُنَّ الْمُسْتَجِنَّ بِطَيْبَةٍ يُنَادِي بِأَعْلَى الصَّوْتِ يَا أَهْلَ هَاشِمٍ وَكَيْفَ تَنَامُ الْعَيْنِ. And how can the eyes sleep at a time of disasters like this that would awaken anyone who is asleep, that would awaken anyone who is asleep? And your brothers in Sham, your brothers in Syria are sleeping in the belly of vultures. And this is war. And the one who is lying in his tomb in Medina, it's almost like he is crying out, O sons of Hashim. What happened? The Caliph was so annoyed by this protest because it coincided with the arrival of his new wife from Isfahan. He even threatened to punish those who had caused this disturbance. So therefore, more concerned about their state, about their seat, than they are with the Muslim Ummah. And this is how it went on. And the days passed. The Crusaders realized, well look, what have we captured? We've captured the main cities of Jerusalem, of Edessa, of Antioch, of Tripoli. And now they wanted to expand. And so they focused their efforts on the coastline. You know, Caesarea, and Haifa, and Acre, and Nablus, and Nazareth, and Jaffa, all the other smaller states and some of the coastline states. And they captured all of them. So one of the first Muslims, we should all know his name. His name was Ali ibn Tahir al-Sulami rahimahullah. He authored a book in 1095 called Kitab al-Jihad, the book of Jihad, where he's trying to wake up the Ummah. You're asleep. You're only interested in your own affairs, and the Muslims in Sham are being slaughtered. He died in 1096. He was the Qadi, he was the Shafi'i Faqih in Damascus. And his text was read in the Umayyad Mosque. And he tried to wake up the Muslims. But there were not many people who listened to him. Everyone became acclimatized to the situation. Almost. People felt as if, you know what, look, come on. It's happened now, and we've been invaded, and there's not much that we can do. But from the lay population, the average Muslim, there was a feeling of anger and resentment and a desire to try and change things. But it didn't happen. And the first year went by.